There we go. I'm going to jump right into the presentation. Today, Santa Barbara has a distinct architectural style and is acclaimed for its Spanish colonial revival architecture. But it was not always the case. At the beginning of the 20th century, Santa Barbara was like most cities and towns in the United States, with worn out, shabby buildings, dusty streets, and non-existent landscaping. So how did Santa Barbara transform itself into this beautiful Spanish town? Bob and I researched this to understand how it all happened. I focused on the history of our Spanish architecture and how different architectural styles evolved over time in Spain and its colonies, while Bob focused on why we chose this particular style, the people that worked towards bringing about this change, and how it all came about after the 1925 earthquake. So to begin with, what is Spanish architecture? Today's Spanish architecture refers to the architecture carried out in any area of what is now Spain and by Spanish architects worldwide. It also includes buildings within the current geographical limits of Spain before this name was given to those regions, such as Iberia, Hispania, Al-Andalus, or the Christian kingdoms to the north. Spanish architecture has also evolved, drawing inspiration from several different sources due to its historical and geographical diversity. The first influence came with the Romans. They built some outstanding monuments in Hispania. Here are some examples, like the Roman aqueduct in Segovia. The Tower of Hercules in Galicia is one of the oldest structures that was built by Romans that's still in use today, and also the ancient ruins in Merida. The next significant period was the Moorish conquest in 711 CE. And this led to a radical change in the southern part of Spain. Great advances were made in architecture over the next 8 centuries. A sophisticated and intricate design style evolved during the Moorish period. Cordoba was established as the cultural capital of its time. An outstanding example of Moorish architecture and decorative style is the Cathedral of Cordoba. Here we see the interior of the dome and the mezquita, and a detail of a horseshoe arch, and the prayer hall with the Moorish columns with a double horseshoe arch that allows for greater ceiling height. While the Moorish conquest and occupation was going on in the south, the Hispanic Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula started developing their own style in the 11th and 12th centuries. Even though the stylistic features were similar to the European Romanesque, certain characteristics were unique to each region of the peninsula. There is no Romanesque art in the southern half of the peninsula because it remained under Muslim rule. A good example of this period is the first Romanesque-style Benedictine monastery of Sant Pere Roads in Catalonia. It shows the nave, the interior, and also the outside. Next came the Spanish Gothic. The Gothic style in Spain evolved from Central European influences in the 12th century, when late Romanesque style was alternated with expressions of pure Gothic architecture. Some of the best Gothic cathedrals in Spain that are closely related to the German and the French Gothic styles were built at this time. The Cuenca Cathedral in Castilla-Manca is one of the earliest examples of Spanish Gothic architecture, and was built at a time when the late Romanesque style was predominant in the Iberian Peninsula. Here we see the interior, the lateral view, and the beautiful facade of the cathedral, and also the interior sexpartite rib vaulting. After the Gothic came the Mudéjar, which started around the 12th and continued all the way to the 17th century. The Mudéjar style had a major influence in Spanish architecture and refers to the application of Moorish decorations and construction methods to existing Christian architecture, producing Mudéjar Romanesque, Mudéjar Gothic, and Mudéjar Renaissance. Mudéjar style did not involve the creation of new structures. Aragon is known for some of the best examples of this style. Here we see the dome of the cathedral in Teruel, and also the exterior of the church of Santa Maria Magdalena and the tower of the church of Utbo, which are both in Zaragoza. After the Mudéjar, or in parallel, we had the Spanish Renaissance, and this refers to a movement emerging from the Italian Renaissance that spread to Spain during the 15th and the 16th century. Here we have a Renaissance facade of the Colegio Mayor de San Alfonso at the University of Alcalá near Madrid, and also the main facade of the convent of Saint Marcus in Leon. Today, this building is a luxury hotel, and it still has the consecrated church and the museum, and is considered to be one of the most important monuments of the Renaissance in Spain. And while the Renaissance was happening, we also have the Spanish Baroque, which was a very distinct style with its exuberant Churrigueresque decorations. And a good example of this style is the facade of the University of Valladolid. This was built in the early 18th century. And we also have the Portada Principal at the Museum of History in Madrid. The neoclassical and other styles also developed from international influences later on in Spain. While the different architectural styles were evolving in Spain, there was also great advances being made in navigation. In the late 15th century, Spanish explorers started embarking on the discovery of the New World, ushering in a new period in Spanish history, the Spanish colonization of the Americas. The laws of the Indies, these are the laws issued by the Spanish crowns for their American and Southeast Asian colonies. And throughout their 400-year presence, the Spanish monarchy issued a series of laws to regulate the life in the colonies. King Philip II developed the first version of the laws of the Indies to guide and regularize the establishment of the presidios, the missions, and the pueblos. Signed in 1573, it is considered to be the first wide-ranging guidelines towards design and development of communities and helping colonists in locating, building, and populating settlements. The La Trazda, or the layout, this was used for establishing the Spanish-American cities during the colonial era. It revolved around a central plaza or a town square with radiating streets. The church, the cabildo, or the town council building, the principal businesses, and the residences of the civil and religious officials were all located around the plaza, and people of higher social status lived closer to the center of town, the center of the political, social, and economic power. Radiating from the main square were streets at right angles, a grid that could extend as the settlement grew. As these colonists settled in their colonies, new architecture evolved, and the Spanish colonial influence on the New World and the East Indies was represented by Spanish colonial architecture. As the cities and towns developed, the colonists were copying the architectural style of the buildings in Spain. The Spanish colonial architecture, as it became known, dominated the early Spanish colonies of North and South America. This style was marked by the contrast between simple, solid construction demanded by the environment and the Baroque ornamentation that was being exported from Spain. Spanish colonial architecture in Mexico, or New Spain. Mexico, or New Spain, was the center of the Spanish colonial empire and also the richest. It has some of the best colonial era architecture. The historic center of Mexico City is a mixture of architectural styles from the 16th century to the present. Here, I have a picture of the Church of St. Domingo and its interior at Oaxaca, and also the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City. What is unique about this cathedral is it was built over a period of 150 years, starting in 1563. It went all the way to 1813. So there were like many different styles incorporated into the design and building of this cathedral, including the Renaissance, the Baroque, and the Neoclassical. And the interior is mostly Baroque. The next style that became popular in Mexico was the Mexican Churrigueresque. This evolved around the late 17th century and continued all the way to mid 18th century, and it was very popular in Mexico. Some of the buildings that were built around that time were in the ultra Baroque style, as you can see, and it had very elaborate ornamentation. And the Cathedral Basilica of Zacatecas and Sagrario Metropolitanos. Next came the expansion of the Spanish colonial empire into Alta California. Interest from other European nations, along with the Russian occupation of Alaska and the fur trading, forced the Spanish monarchy to extend its empire northwards into Alta California. A series of 21 missions were established as part of this expansion between 1769 and 1833. The missions were built by the Catholic priests of the Franciscan order and stretched between Mission San Diego de Alcala in the south to Mission San Francisco de Solano to the north. A typical mission layout, as you can see, has the church, the sleeping quarters of the padres, the workshops, the kitchen, as well as the storerooms. There is also a water source in the middle of the courtyard with the Indian settlement outside, irrigation ditches, and also the location of the mission is pretty close to a water source. The design of the missions, the limited availability of building materials and skilled labor significantly influenced the design of the Alta California missions. Mission designs were simple with enclosed courtyards, adobe walls, limited fenestrations, low pitched roof with projecting wide eaves, and non-flammable clay roof tiles. Exterior walls were coated with white stucco or plaster, which along with the side eaves shielded the adobe brick walls from rain. There were also long exterior arcades supported by thick arches supported by piers and bell gables, and some of the more prosperous missions had the Baroque gables. The historic significance of the mission: some of the oldest cities developed around or near the missions, for example, San Francisco and San Diego. The mission lands were divided into land grants later on, and they became many of the ranchos of California. The mission legacy: the surviving mission buildings are the oldest and the most visited historic monuments and an inspiration for the mission revival architecture. The 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago was an important milestone. The mission revival style was first seen here. A. Page Brown's California State Building at the 1893 Columbian Exposition was one of the earliest designs in what became known as the mission revival style. Its architecture was in the style of the old California mission. Brown incorporated mission details such as the red tile roof, domed bell towers, Churrigueresque stars, scallop gables, and stucco walls to represent an emerging California identity. The mission revival style was popular between 1893 and 1917 and was used in numerous residential, commercial, and institutional structures. The city beautification movement, it evolved from the White City of the Chicago World Columbian Exposition, and it is credited for ushering in the city beautiful movement and planting the seeds of modern day city planning. It was a progressive social reform movement resulting from the poor living conditions in major cities and was originally associated with Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. It's also credited for the construction of monuments and influenced urban planning throughout the 20th century. The Spanish colonial revival style is an architectural style that emerged in the early 20th century based on the Spanish colonial architecture of the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Architects Bertram Goodhue and Carlton Winslow are credited with popularizing this style during the 1915 San Diego, Panama, California Exposition. The Spanish colonial revival movement enjoyed its greatest popularity between 1915 and 1931 and became the dominant historical regional style in California. It also shares some similarities with the early and mission revival style and incorporates details from several period architectures such as Spanish Baroque, Mission Revival, Spanish Colonial, and Mexican Churrigueresque. Key elements of this style include the use of stucco or smooth plaster walls and chimney finishes, low-pitched clay tile roofs, terracotta or cast iron ornaments, small porches, balconies, Roman or semicircular arcades, and fenestrations, canvas awnings, and decorative trim. Some notable examples of this style include the design of Rancho Santa Fe by architect Lillian Jeanette Rice, and other notable examples also include the city halls of Sonoma, Pasadena, and Beverly Hills. Our own city of Santa Barbara used this style to give our city a unified Spanish character after the widespread destruction of the 1925 earthquake. Here we see our county courthouse designed by William Moser III, which is a prime example of this style. Our courthouse, along with many other buildings, were inspired by the Spanish colonial revival architecture. And here are my sources and credits. And now to talk about how and why we were influenced by this style is Bob.
Well, let me start by toasting you. Salud. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon / evening. We've heard from Aparna how architecture evolved over time and how several forms of Spanish architecture came about in both Spain and the New World. So my role in this was why we chose this particular style and how it got implemented. It seems simple at first. We were claimed by Spain. We were under Spanish rule for half a century, under Mexican rule, New Spain, for another quarter century. So it's only natural that we'd go back to our roots and pick an architecture style to represent us. And as far as how we did it, we had an earthquake. We had to rebuild. But it turns out it wasn't quite as straightforward as that. Sure, we were under Spanish rule, but Alta California was an isolated outpost. It was difficult to get here by either land or by sea. We rarely saw a representative of Spain. Our building materials were minimal. Our architectural style with mud huts with dirt floors. Even our castles, the Presidio and the first few versions of the Mission, were adobe. We did whitewash the walls and put red tile roofs on them so that from the ocean, sailors wrote in the 1830s that Santa Barbara looked like a pretty town. One sailor wrote that it looked as if we had put all of our buildings into a blunderbuss, shot it into the air, and let the buildings remain wherever they landed. So clearly we weren't yet into city planning. But they also wrote that as they approached the town, it was, the buildings were crude, town was dirty. This was clearly not the architectural style we wanted for our Renaissance. And as far as the earthquake, yes, we had to rebuild. But other similarities, earthquake, hurricane, and they hadn't fared so well. Santa Barbara, after the earthquake, was a prettier city, and the buildings were stronger. So again, I went back to why and how. I've found that events like this don't just happen. It's typically a series of steps that lead up to it. So I tried to see if I could locate those steps, identify them, see if there was some sort of pattern, see where they might have all started. Actually, the starting point, there are several logical starting points, including the La Traza that Aparna mentioned, the city planning. But the one I like best is in 1876. By that time, several events had happened in Santa Barbara that I think gave us a platform for our transformation. A few years earlier, John Stearns had completed his wharf, 1,500 feet out into the ocean, far enough that ships could dock even at low tide, and passengers could step off in comfort and product could be loaded and unloaded efficiently. Before that, ships would anchor miles off our coast, put people and product into open tenders, row them through the waves and through the surf, commonly overturning when they got to the beach. One of the first visitors, sorry, lost my train of thought. One of the first visitors, seeing those people double over. I also meant to mention, and lumber. If lumber had been ordered, it was tossed into the ocean and herded into the shore like a flock of sheep. Often when it got to the surf, it would disperse and break up on the rocky beach. And so the owner of the lumber yard would be forced to walk up and down the beach collecting the remnants of his order of lumber. And his name was John Stearns. Good motivation for building a wharf. One of our first visitors to the wharf was the popular journalist Charles Nordhoff. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed a few years before that, tying New York to the Bay Area, and they wanted people to fill those cars taking the train. So they hired Nordhoff to write about how fun and exciting it was to take the train to California. And he did really nice articles with lovely illustrations. He said at one point, you can visit a foreign country without even leaving the United States. You can board the train in the east and go to California and see the mountains and the valleys of Yosemite, the magnificent beaches and bluffs of the California coast. He stepped off the boat onto Stearns Wharf, and he took in our Mediterranean climate, and he said, "This is the American Riviera." And he wrote encouraging people to come here for their health and recreation. He also said to our city leaders that we needed a decent hotel, one up from the beach, so that people coming for their health wouldn't be forced to breathe the cool, damp air of the ocean. And thanks to Colonel Hollister, we built the Arlington Hotel, one of the 3 prettiest hotels in California, compared favorably with the Del Coronado. It was completed in 1876, and people arrived, often staying for 2 to 3 months at a time. That same year, on the other side of the country, in Philadelphia, they were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence with a grand centennial exposition. They also put forth the notion that we could have a single architectural model that would represent all of the United States. Not surprisingly, the model they suggested was colonial Gothic, which fit well with New England. But the rest of the country wasn't interested in that. We had too many different conditions. In California, it was put forth the idea that maybe we'd have a Western model that would pair with the Eastern model. And the informal leader of that movement was Charles Fletcher Loomis, who was then city editor of the LA Times and an advocate of Western architecture. He and his friends started the California Landmarks Club in order to preserve some of the remaining missions. By that time, many of our missions had deteriorated, some to the point where all you could see would be foundations and remnants of walls. And the Landmarks Club and other organizations began to do what they could to preserve and restore these missions. At the same time, a cadre of Western artists embraced the plein air movement, painting outside where you can see the nuances of the changes of the light. And the missions were perfect subject for them. They had what Dana would refer to as decayed grandeur. So with one of the artists, Edward Deacon, painted all 21 of the missions, both in watercolors and in oils. The 21 watercolors are in the collection of the Historical Museum here in Santa Barbara. The oils are in the collection of the Old Mission in Santa Barbara and the archives. So with this exposure of these mystical images by the artists, and with the work of restoration and preservation of the missions, features of the missions began to appear in current construction. One of the most outstanding was the Riverside Mission Inn, designed by A.B. Benson, who was a friend of Loomis and a member of the Landmarks Club. About that time, they were planning for the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, commonly called the Chicago World's Fair that Aparna mentioned. And the underlying motivation there was a way to handle the harshness that industrialization was imposing on American citizens, feeling that a beautiful city and exposure to the arts would not only give our citizens a nicer place to live, but would make their actions a little more refined. And this was the beginning of the city beautification movement. As Aparna mentioned, California had a building in that beautiful city, and over some objections, it was designed in what would become called the Mission Revival style, combining mission features with the Romanesque flavor. It was very popular and inaugurated the Mission Revival, giving it some credibility as an architectural style. In further support of this nostalgic look backward was a romance novel written by Helen Hunt Jackson, Ramona, about a woman who, of Scottish Native American heritage, who lived in the remaining days of the Mexican era. This fantasy described the era where the Indians and the Mexicans lived harmoniously, often in these big Spanish haciendas on large ranches. And people reading that longed for this quieter, simpler life. They were already feeling the pinch of industrialization on their earlier values. And this was represented well by the haciendas and by the old missions. So in Southern California, we began building homes in this Mission Revival style. Old Spanish haciendas in Santa Barbara. We had 5 built for William Crocker that still exist. And then the one on the end with the bronze dog is still an excellent example of Mission Revival homes. By this time, the railroads had completed a line through the south to California, through New Mexico and Arizona. And again, they needed people to fill those cars. So they drew on the popularity of the Mission Revival building at the World's Fair and the nostalgia for this older, fantasized time of California, and built their train stations in this Mission Revival style, often with nearby hotels in the same style. So when you took the train, you were taking a trip through time. Santa Barbara's Amtrak station is a good example of that. We had a collaborate examples that got destroyed. The Potter Hotel by fire, and the second Arlington Hotel by earthquake. After a while, architects who had been trained in the traditional style tired of this fairly simplistic Mission Revival feature, Mission Revival with simple straight lines, squat look, random decorative features. And they began to promote and design in a style that had actual roots back in Spain on the Mediterranean, in Andalusia, the Spanish colonial revival. Homes were built in Southern California in this style, but it was the exposition that Aparna mentioned that really was the flashpoint. Honoring the opening of the Panama Canal in 1915, all the buildings were built in the Spanish colonial style, although some were very heavily ornamented with this Churrigueresque ornamentation. But it really appealed to Southern California. In 1920, a group of Santa Barbara citizens, building on the city beautification movement, established the Community Arts Association with an arm for music, one for drama, and one for allied arts. They bought and restored the Libero Theater. And then in 1922, they added a fourth arm, Plans and Planning Committee, with Bernard Hoffman as chairman and secretary, Miss Pearl Chase. When Bernard Hoffman and his wife Irene arrived in Santa Barbara, they were impressed with the old adobes that we had and felt they should be nurtured in order to maintain our heritage. They first hired James Osborne Craig to build their home in this newly evolving Spanish style. And then they had him restore the Casa de la Guerra, the Casa Grande, back to its original elegance. It had deteriorated significantly. And then they built another Spanish complex right behind it with offices, studios, stores, restaurants, El Paseo. But Hoffman and Chase knew that just random individual buildings weren't going to accomplish their goal of a Spain in America. To do that, they needed an infrastructure, and to do that, they needed planning. So they went about emphasizing the city planning. But in the meantime, all this residential construction attracted architects. James Osborne Craig, George Washington Smith, Luta Maria Riggs, Joseph Plunkett, and from the Southland, Reginald Johnson, Carlton Winslow, Myron Hunt, and others. And these architects, particularly Craig, Smith, Riggs, and Plunkett, took this Spanish colonial revival style and adjusted it, made it a little abstract, a little more simple, and simultaneously a little more complex, which really appealed to our population, which became the Santa Barbara style architecture. We had with this pool of architects a resource, and they started the design center where they would volunteer their time to help you build in this Spanish style. And after the 1925 earthquake, if you lived in Santa Barbara long, you know it takes a year and a half, two to get a building permit. After the 1925 earthquake, we issued 2,000 building permits in 9 months because of this resource stuff, this architectural resource. And in 1929, Santa Barbara was the epitome of a Spanish town rising from the rubble. And it appeared in all the architectural journals and all the home and garden magazines. And so, why did we pick this? What steps led to it? Well, I think the harshness of industrialization made us nostalgic for simpler times. And that was not only fed, it was expanded with the fantasy of Ramona, and then with the examples that Loomis and his cohorts did in restoration and the images from the arts. That developed an interest in mission revival. And so we saw the popularity of that style at the World's Fair, and then the ubiquitousness in train stations, buildings, and homes, showing that we could have an architecture style that tied us to our own past, a somewhat imagined past, but our own past. And then that 1915 San Diego Exposition, it really showed us what a town could look like with this kind of style architecture. And our local architects were able to put a nuance onto this to make it a little more abstract, which appealed to our population, so that we came up with what I think can legitimately called, although it's somewhat sometimes questioned, the Santa Barbara architectural style. And how did we do it? It started with that city beautification movement, although that was already built on city planning, going back again to La Traza. It relied on the wealthy who came here because of our appealing weather environment, wanting to build residences, therefore drawing a pool of architects. And of course, Hoffman and Chase, they couldn't have done it alone. There were a lot of people who involved, but they were the focal point. It probably couldn't have been done without them. Their emphasis on planning and infrastructure, so we had something that we could build around, not just individual pieces. So the wealthy building the residences and the architects interested in that style gave us the model. Hoffman and Chase gave us the infrastructure. And for the perfect storm, the earthquake, it gave us the need. So that we evolved after all this, our Santa Barbara's architectural renaissance.